thank you for joining. We will start our webinar in about 2 minutes. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for our global audience, and happy Valentine's Day. My name is Alex Pavasovich. I'm the head of fraud risk here at Unit21. Thank you for joining today's webinar on romance fraud with Jack Spiro of Fingerprint and Chris DePaul of Elliptic. I will be moderating today's conversation. For those of you who are not familiar with Unit21, we are risk and compliance infrastructure that allow you to ingest any type of data and utilize it for your transaction monitoring needs. We also have a case management solution, which allows you to streamline your risk and operational efforts and to file SAR and FinCENs. Now I will invite our speakers to introduce themselves and their organization. Chris, why don't you start first?
Happy to, thanks, and great to be here. I'm Chris DePaul. I'm the head of risk management at Elliptic. Elliptic is a blockchain analytics firm that provides transaction monitoring, wallet screening, and investigations for the digital asset sector. We leverage proprietary data to help customers understand financial crime risk and different vectors for on-chain crime. I'm a regulatory lawyer by training with a background in banking, financial crimes compliance, but have happily been working in the digital asset consulting space for about 2 years now. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Chris. Jack, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, everyone. Nice to be here today. My name is Jack Spiro. I'm the head and director of product at Fingerprint. Fingerprint is a company that really specializes in device identification, and we really focus on using device identification to fight all kinds of fraud, including romance fraud that we'll talk a little bit about today. We can also be used for other aspects other than fraud and protect, such as growing your business or deeper tracking and analytics as well. But today we'll be focused on identification and fraud.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jack. And thank you for taking the time to share your experience with our audience today. For today's discussion, we will take a collective look on romance fraud and how it's been impacting the industry and the world in the past few years. Then we will move into some common scams that we are seeing trending lately in different financial institutions. And we will share some insights on how organizations can protect themselves and their customers from falling victims to romance fraud. A few housekeeping items to keep in mind. We will begin the webinar shortly. We will have a Q&A and also a poll at the end of the webinar, and we will hopefully have some time for you to submit live questions as we finish our 3 topics. So I think we can go ahead and get started. So a bit of background. The FBI reported last year that over 24,000 Americans have been fallen victim to romance fraud and romance scam, which accumulated up to $1 billion of losses. And actually, the FTC posted that in 2022, that number rose to 70,000 victims and accumulated to losses of 1.3 billion. So the impact on the financial sector is obviously staggering, and it doesn't seem like romance scam is slowing down. Chris, I'd like to get your take on romance fraud and how you've been seeing it evolve in the past few years.
Yeah, happy to. And thanks again. So I think one of the things to be keenly aware of when thinking about romance fraud is that this is a fraud typology that typically targets vulnerable populations. People who are maybe crypto naive, don't have a lot of technological experience and background in general, who are susceptible to these types of fraud events, may be convinced to contribute funds to these fraudsters without doing great deal of due diligence on who they are, on getting appropriate background information, making sure that they really understand the person with whom they're dealing before sending funds over. A lot of times people are very hesitant to believe that they've been scammed and to report these types of incidents because of the fact that they've established this personal relationship, or what they believe to be a personal relationship. And that's sort of the tragedy of this. You're taking people, you're exploiting them in sort of the most vulnerable way possible, and in a way that really does a lot of damage, not just financially, but psychologically, emotionally. You make people think that they have a genuine connection and then use it to extract money from them. And then we'll often see these scammers take the funds and move them through a variety of obfuscation techniques when they're working in a crypto context. So that could be using something like a mixer, that could be sending funds to offshore or poorly regulated exchanges in an attempt to hide their transaction history, and hopefully for them to exit out to fiat dollars eventually. And, we're doing this on Valentine's Day. There's this tie-in, but I don't want to be glib about it. This is really a tragic type of fraud that occurs that hurts some of the most vulnerable folks in the economy, and is something that we as a service provider are working hard to help eliminate. And I know that our partners in the industry are as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. And well, you mentioned that bad actors, they do love crypto, and it seems like it's still the most popular form of payment that they will try to go ahead and convince their victims sending them. And you mentioned vulnerable population. If you can give one tip maybe to people who are absolutely new to crypto investing and really taking their first steps into crypto, what would it be? How they can protect themselves from falling victims to romance fraud?
Yeah, particularly when it comes to romance scams, you want to ensure that you know the person that you're dealing with before sending any funds, and that the person that you believe you're dealing with is in fact that person, right? That they're not misrepresenting themselves, that they're not using a fake or stolen identity to convince you that they're someone they're not. Ideally, you have an in-person, real-life connection with this individual. You have a form of communication that you trust and that you communicate with that person on frequently, and you know their wallet address, you know perhaps the institution that they're using as an exchange or a custodian. So when you're sending funds, you can be sure that you're sending them to the right place. And that's the most difficult part about romance scams as a fraud typology, right? Often these relationships are established through non-traditional means, whether that be a social media site, a dating app, whatever the case might be. And because of that, you may often not know in person the counterparty that you're dealing with. We would always recommend to not send funds to any source that isn't verified and can't be trusted, either through other folks using them as a service repeatedly. If you're talking about a merchant, say, or if you're talking about a person that you're dealing with, someone like you might seek to send funds to in a ransomware situation or in a romance scam, that you actually understand the identity of the person that you're dealing with.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Jack, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yeah. I think we talked a lot about the transactions and how transactions are definitely a part of romance scams, but romance scams don't just happen on dating apps. They also happen on a ton of other social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. In fact, over a third of people who lost money in 2021 were first contacted on either Facebook or Instagram. There was also an 80% increase in 2020 to 2021 in reported losses that really total in almost $500 million just in 2021. So I think, this is a rapidly evolving sector of fraud and a really effective way to scam consumers out of money. One of the things that's very interesting, especially around social media and all of these other different dating app sites, is that it's hard to track people, right, across say Facebook, Twitter, and maybe some of these social media applications and dating apps. And so that's where good identity products can really help out, trying to identify folks across multiple different platforms.
Thank you for that, Jack. And you mentioned that third of the romance scams start with social media. Do you have maybe any tips for social media safety for the consumers out there?
Yeah. Much like Chris said, I would just repeat, you should really try to know the person that you're actually, about to send money to, or make sure that you understand who they are and validate their identity. In many ways, we talk about know your customer quite a bit for businesses. And in this sense, you should really probably know the other person on the other side of that transaction. But in terms of social media tips, there's probably a bunch of security preferences and privacy preferences that you can also set within your social media account. Such as who has access to see you, who can reach out to you, and actually that might help with even simple forms of this scam, such as even identity theft, right? If someone is trying to pretend to be somebody else. So just by looking at your social media preferences and your privacy settings, there's a lot you can do just to counteract the beginnings of many of the obvious forms of social media attacks, such as identity theft.
This is great. Thank you for that, Jack. And it feels like Roman fraud and Roman scam in general, they come in various different forms, but it's always like the same story. It's always someone who will reach out online, either on social media or any other platform. Usually they try to avoid the best they can any face-to-face communication or actually meeting in real life. And it always sense of urgency into transferring any payments or funds, which pretty much leads us to the next topic of the webinar, which is common romance scam and how to identify them. Jack, would you like to start?
Yeah, $2,400. That's the median amount reported by individuals in 2021 that loss had some form of loss to romance fraud. While this can happen with fake accounts on dating apps or those requesting money from users, romance fraud can really occur in places where users communicate with each other generally. And that's where they can prey, these bad actors can prey on unsuspecting users. Many times users will get requests from scammers who they've never met in person. So that's fairly common. And also, say over the phone or in video conferencing. And the scammer will generally use some form of fake health or financial crisis, some sort of urgency that they'll create in order to convince a user to send money to them. And usually the money that they will ask for, or the methodology of sending it, will be in some form of a gift card, maybe crypto or wire transfer. And all these sources and all these ways of transferring money can sometimes make it impossible or nearly impossible to recoup that investment or recoup that money after it's been sent. Finally, in other cases, there are some personal information that can be requested. And this again can be anything such as a full name, address, date of birth. And again, this goes back to the identity theft example that I called out a little earlier, especially say on social media. And then folks can use that identity to take out loans or maybe some other nefarious form of fraud.
Yeah, and you know what? I really like this last point you just mentioned. In many cases, romance scam doesn't really end with, hey, I transferred the Bitcoin and that's it. If the bad actor controls your personal information and you really fall victim for romance scam, they will not stop there. They will either try to take over any other existing accounts of the victim. They will use the victim's identity and go ahead and create new accounts, new credit lines. So potentially the financial loss can be much higher, and the impact of something that might be started as a romance scam can be much worse. So thank you for that. Chris, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fully agree with what's been said. And I think that, we're all making the point that understanding the counterparty that you're dealing with and making sure that this isn't just a fictitious identity that's been created, or again, an identity that's been stolen, is probably the key thing to keep in mind here. When it does come to identifying these bad actors, one thing that we'll often note is that there can be an on-chain, on-blockchain association with another type of scam typology as well, right? So oftentimes people who are involved in romance scams are not only involved in romance scams. They may be involved in credit card theft and credit card vending. They may be involved in dark web marketplaces. They may be involved in other types of scams and fraudulent activity, hacks, things like that. And if you see those overlaps and you notice from, for instance, an exchange perspective that your customers are sending funds out to a wallet that has an association with this type of bad activity, we would expect those centralized intermediaries to have controls in place to stop that from taking place, to be able to identify that activity and prevent it. Because again, it's often the case that you're not just seeing someone who's effectuating a romance scam, but they're involved in lots of other bad activity as well. I think the dollar value that was mentioned before, the $2,400 value transfer, is another thing to key in on. And again, fully agree with that. You're typically looking at what we would sort of term as retail level value transfers, right? Now, $2,400 is a lot for the person being scammed, but it's not a lot compared to sort of an institutional movement of funds. And if you see small amounts moving to wallets that have this known financial crime association with romance fraud already, and you see your customers engaging in that type of activity, for instance, it's very possible that they might be the victim of one of these types of attacks. And again, when talking about that personal information that might be compromised, whether it's your social security number or bank account information, all of that, it's often obtained through one of these social media vectors, right? And let's include dating apps in that as well. And so again, it's very important. And this is something we emphasize to our partners in the industry when they're providing education to their customers, is to ensure that people know not to share any of their personal information, but also any of their sort of personal blockchain-based information with parties who might use that for nefarious purposes, whether that's to exploit you and to run a scam, whether it's to steal from you. We are very strong in believing that maintaining the security of your personal information is one of the best ways to prevent yourself from becoming victim to one of these types of scams.
Thank you for that, Chris. And before we dive into the third topic, which what organization can do to keep customers safe, any tips for customers and consumers who might be thinking that they fall victim to romance scam? If you feel like, suddenly you have a red light, you see that maybe money is missing from your bank account, or you feel like you've been tricked to something, what are the first steps customers should take in order to stop what it's already started happening? Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of this is accurate on-chain transaction monitoring when looking at it from a crypto perspective, which is certainly, what we specialize in, and making sure that your database of bad actors is updated on a regular basis and to make sure that you're looking for behavior associated with this type of scam, right? I mean, that's what we sort of do day in, day out. Our bread and butter is making associations with known bad actors on chain and updating that database so that you have good visibility into bad actors that might be looking to exploit your customers or your counterparties, whatever the case might be. A big sort of rule of thumb in the digital asset space in general is that the fraud and AML and more generally financial crime basics that we all derive from the fiat world still play a big role here and are still the same. Knowing your customer, knowing what typical behavior looks like, knowing who standard counterparties are, and alerting on and mitigating any risk associated with something that falls outside of that norm. That's the best way to protect customers from being exploited. And it's nothing new. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're taking the same general precepts and just applying them in a new context.
Thank you for that. So I think now when we understand a bit how bad actors operate and what is the drastic impact that can happen both for individuals and financial companies due to romance scam, let's look at the next topic which we have for today, which is what organization can actually do to keep customers safe. And Chris, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think the main thing that we should do here is prevent this activity from happening before it actually occurs. So particularly if you have, someone who has funds at a crypto exchange who might be falling victim to a romance scam and has been asked to send an amount of money out to the scammer. We want the exchange to have rules in place, to have controls in place ahead of time to identify that activity, identify the wallet associated with this scammer, and interdict that transaction before it ever actually occurs. One of the benefits of leveraging blockchain analytics technology is the fact that you can look at a counterparty wallet and through sort of a customized risk rating, risk scoring capability, make a determination as to the likelihood that this is a bad guy. You should be doing that ahead of time, particularly when it comes to fraud typologies that are going to impact, again, the most vulnerable folks involved in the sector. Again, typically people who don't have a whole lot of sophistication with regard to how on-chain activity actually works. And then you should also conduct transaction lookbacks to find historic patterns of abuse, identify where this has been a problem for the organization in the past, and put new policies, procedures, controls in place to prevent it from happening again. You can't catch everything, right? And I think any sort of fraud or AML professional would say the same thing. You're never going to stop 100% of the bad activity, but you have a duty to on an ongoing basis, make your program stronger, make your program better by looking at historic transactions and ensuring that you do the best you can to mitigate that risk going forward. And then education, which is, I think, something we've both touched on already and will probably touch on again. Educating your customers and highlighting the risks associated with romance scams, letting them know what scammers might say to them, where they might reach out to them. All of this can be hugely beneficial in preventing the problem from happening, because you will make someone more aware of the fact that they might be exploited or might be subject to some sort of attempt to scam them out of their money. And then lastly, just ensure that your customers aren't the scammers, right? And you also have a problem with people on the flip side who are leveraging, again, call it a crypto exchange, right, to collect funds in from the people being scammed. So looking for those same types of risks within your customers as bad actors as you would when looking at your customers as potential victims is really important to make sure that you're not facilitating this bad activity in some way. And if you do see, let's say you have a customer who might be suspected to be a bad actor, or you have a customer who's a victim who's sending funds out to a particular exchange over and over again, whether it be the customer as victim sending funds to another exchange or the customer as bad actor sending funds to another exchange to get them off of your platform, you should be looking at that other exchange. If there's a propensity for bad dollars to flow there consistently in an outsized manner, maybe they don't have the appropriate risk controls in place, and you should be doing some counterparty due diligence to determine whether or not you're comfortable maintaining that relationship as well.
I completely agree. And I think to your last point, it's important to look beyond the KYC and really understand the context. Like you said, you might, if you are an exchange, you might have bad actors on your exchange. So you might KYC them and the identity might come as real or authentic, but you need to understand the context. If you have an entity who you think it's, elementary teacher or maybe a local plumber that hold $2 or $3 million worth of cryptocurrency asset, that probably doesn't make sense. So I think it's up to us really understand better who are our customers and how they interact with each other and how they're moving funds in and out from our platform. So thank you for that. Jack, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think Chris went through a bunch of great analysis and behavioral analysis that's needed, but there might even be some just simple signs of fraud that can also be analyzed or can be noticed. So such as substantial purchases. Maybe there are multiple orders of something, potentially failed attempts or multiple failed attempts to make a purchase within a short time period. Many times illegitimate orders based on stolen credit card information as well, if these are known stolen bad credit cards. So I would say that, there's many different ways to identify behavioral patterns of fraud that are taking place. And then the next piece is really that just because you've identified a behavioral pattern or some kind of flag or some kind of risk tolerance is or gate is being checked, the next question is, how do you identify those users and how do you ensure that they get added to a blacklist in some way? And I would say that your ability to identify fraud and to action against it is only as good as your identification capability and how do you identify those users in a repeatable way. And that's where Fingerprint can really help. But that's where we would recommend a solution like Fingerprint so that even if somebody is attempting to conceal their identity, say through using multiple email addresses, multiple phone numbers, perhaps they're using multiple devices, you can use a technology like Fingerprint or a product like Fingerprint in order to really get a 99.5% accuracy rating to block them in the future. In many ways, I know we're talking about romance fraud today, but in general, right, those folks that are committing romance fraud are bad actors, and Fingerprint is a great product to help you really stop any kind of bad actors that are on your platform, either from making poor financial transactions or fraudulent financial transactions, or from mitigating against bad behavior. Say that's a double-sided marketplace of some kind. And if you think about it, a lot of these dating apps are nothing but double-sided marketplaces, right? People trying to matchmake with each other and get together. And then the last bit is to really educate customers about fraud. In many ways, I think we talked a lot about this education piece. of explaining to folks that there is fraud that can be occurring on double-sided marketplaces, or to the end user to be clear about who they should trust in terms of their context. But even just giving users an indication of a level of risk is something that's a great thing to do as well. And it feels like many times these are things that we are nervous to talk about. Romance fraud is something that's a touchy subject and people don't want to bring up, like Chris had mentioned earlier. And in some sense, it's better to talk about it than not, in order to protect more people on the internet from it. So again, it's a touchy subject, but we should probably educate each other about it.
Thank you so much for that, Jack. And I have a question for you, Chris. From your experience, do you know, or are you aware of any collaborations between law enforcement and regulators, or maybe law enforcement and financial institution to help consumers to avoid romance scam, or any other initiatives that you're aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the answer is yes to both. So law enforcement is highly active in this space. I mean, the majority of federal law enforcement agencies and many local law enforcement agencies as well are leveraging blockchain analytics solutions, for instance, to conduct on-chain investigations into where funds flow once there's been a reported romance scam incident. So just to back things up a bit, I spoke briefly before about when a scammer might be operating out of a centralized exchange and receiving funds there, and they might send them to another exchange. They might try to exit into fiat dollars if you don't catch them quickly enough, whatever the case might be. But there's a separate way in which this can occur that's also prevalent and that sort of presents a different risk profile. And that's folks operating through what's called an unhosted wallet. So for anyone who's not familiar, you can have a hosted wallet that sits at an exchange. We're all familiar with some of the big names in the space, and they effectively manage the custody of your funds on your behalf. You can also self-custody your crypto funds, and you can do that through a software wallet that you might keep on your phone. You can create paper wallets, and there are all kinds of instructions in how to do this on the internet. There are hardware wallets that you plug into your computer and that give you access to your funds. And these are effectively, systems that exist to hold funds that have no kind of KYC checks in place, right? Anyone can create one of these wallets and act totally pseudonymously, not have any association of their identity to this wallet. And we'll often see scammers take funds into these unhosted wallets. And what that does is it makes it much more challenging to actually identify who the individual behind the scam is, who the responsible party actually is. So this is where the use of analytics tools comes into play when working with law enforcement in order to track the bad guys. One of the huge benefits of crypto is the fact that, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, we have a completely transparent blockchain where every transaction going back an infinite number of steps can be effectively monitored and investigated. And so if I send funds to person A, who sends them to person C, who sends them to person B, who sends them to person J, and so on and so forth, you can track all of those movements of funds on chain. And what that allows us to do is determine when someone is actually attempting to off-ramp into fiat dollars. Because at the end of the day, even if you hold those funds in an unhosted wallet, the vast majority of bad actors here, they want to get out to dollars, because although there are many merchants that are beginning to accept crypto, it's still much easier to use fiat money to actually effectuate a purchase of some sort, right? The bad guy wants to buy a car, or they want to send money to a partner of theirs, whatever the case might be. It's more practical oftentimes to have access to dollars or euros or pounds or whatever the case might be to do that. And so investigators working within law enforcement agencies will use tools within a blockchain analytics tooling suite in order to follow those movements of funds. You'll often see different types of laundering techniques applied here. So maybe you split funds off into many individual wallets. You can create effectively as many wallet addresses, I should say, as you like, and send funds to each of them, and then reconsolidate and split again and go through all types of layering techniques that anyone sort of familiar with fiat AML will be somewhat, used to and used to seeing, and then reconsolidate and attempt to exit out to dollars. Law enforcement is able to follow these funds the entire way and ensure that the bad guy is not able to successfully get out to fiat currency so long as they're going or attempting to go through a regulated exchange or an exchange in a jurisdiction that has friendly relations with the law enforcement agency's jurisdiction. So if you're sitting in the US and they attempt to exit out to a fiat exchange in the UK, for instance, there are all kinds of cooperative agreements there that allow those law enforcement bodies to work together in a way so as to limit the ability to exit those funds. What's more challenging is when these bad actors will use obfuscation techniques in order to hide their transaction history. So people here may be familiar with mixers. I mentioned them briefly before. What mixers are effectively services that allow you to take your crypto, mix them up, and spit them out on the other side so that you don't know who the party receiving the funds actually is, right? It breaks the chain, so to speak. So typical blockchain analytics techniques are much more difficult to apply. Funds can be demixed, but it's time consuming, it's resource intensive. It is something that we do, but it does make things more challenging. And this is where we've seen regulators step up in a big way to limit risk exposure here. So in the US, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, for instance, has actually sanctioned several mixers now because of their facilitation of sanctions evasion. And it limits, crime in the same way as you could see in a romance scam scenario. So although the sanctions that were specifically applied to mixers related to sanctions evasion and that type of activity, again, regulators prohibiting interactions with mixers that might be known to support romance scam money laundering is also another tool in the toolkit that can be used to prevent these folks from being able to get out to fiat. And that really is the name of the game here. At the end of the day, everyone who is receiving funds for one of these scam events in crypto eventually wants to get out to dollars. And it is the responsibility of those exchange intermediaries that provide that fiat to crypto exchange service to ultimately limit their way to do so. If those entities don't serve as choke points, then the battle's lost here, right? It's really about cooperation between law enforcement, regulated entities, and regulators to create an ecosystem where fraudsters can't thrive because there are such strong controls in place that they're not able to actually get out to dollars. As we see an evolution toward crypto being used more and more with direct merchant services integrations, that's where we're also going to need to bring those merchants into the fold to say, hey, am I comfortable with the source of funds here that my customers bring to the table when paying for a good? And that's a fairly unique concept. It's not something that we would require, for instance, in a traditional retail context, because you have a bank or a money services business on the other side that's sort of serving that financial crime risk detection role that would be looking for the individual, for instance, that's involved in fraud. Here, because you can have these unhosted wallets in certain contexts, we're going to need an expansion of responsibility across multiple actors in the industry to ensure that people that are perpetuating these frauds aren't able to successfully use them in sort of the illicit economy.
Yeah, and this is an amazing insight, and thank you so much for that, Chris. So in order to summarize the third topic, really, we discussed monitoring and screening wallets and understanding what are the high risk associated with those wallets. We discussed having a great identity verification tools and device verification tools in place, and really making sense out of the KYC and what type of assets we're seeing on those wallets. And I think the most important is really keep educating our end users and customers on how to protect themselves and how romance scammers are look like. So before we jump to the Q&A, Jack, Chris, do you have anything to add?
Only thing I'd add or maybe repeat is just that a lot of times, a lot of these products and folks that have people on their products or double-sided marketplaces or folks where talent or individuals around. So it could be dating sites like we've talked today. It could be eBay. It could be Uber. It could be any kind of services application. Many times what you're really talking about here are bad actors, and you're trying to keep bad actors out of that marketplace, whatever that marketplace might be, or out of that product. And the more bad actors you have on that product, generally the value of the product in general goes down, right? The quality of the product goes down. And so if the quality of the product is directly tied to the quality of the people, you want to make sure that you have some way to ensure that you're banning folks and keeping bad actors out. And again, that's where I think, Fingerprint as a product can really be useful and helpful in that 99.5% identification of devices. And what we tend to find is, once you have a couple bad actors on a device, even if it's multiple bad actors or some kind of fraud farm, they tend to be using the same devices. And so once we ban it, we can ban groups of people out and really increase the quality of that product, right, in general. And so I know today we talked a lot about romance fraud in particular, but in general, these are bad actors. And once we identify them in some way, we really want to have the ability, I think, to ban them from that product in order to keep the quality of the product high and then therefore the value of these products high as well.
Yeah, would really just want to echo those sentiments. And I fully agree that implementing effective controls in order to be able to blacklist not only single, for instance, in a crypto context, addresses associated with a person, but any addresses associated with that person, and the need for partnership between industry participants. That's why, we obviously admire the work that Fingerprint does. It's also why we build out solutions that are designed to take a holistic look at risk from an on-chain perspective across all different risk typologies that we might see. Romance scams very much included in that. Last thing that I would say is that we've talked a lot about education here, and I don't think it can be underscored enough. Making folks know that there are bad actors out there and that every interpersonal relationship that someone might seek to establish on a social media platform might not be genuine. That's the most important part here. And it's really tough because many people, they feel socially isolated. They don't have maybe a lot of other connections. And when someone comes along, establishes that connection and seeks to exploit them, it can be really painful. And taking some of the shame out of reporting these incidences, letting folks know that this is very common, that they weren't sort of uniquely tricked or fooled. You're not dumb, right? You're not less than for having been subject to this type of attack. Removing that stigma and getting people to report more of these, it helps us to build out our database and understand where these bad actors are sitting, what type of activity they're engaging in, and it will help to protect people in the future. And so that's a huge part of this, is communicating and educating customers so that they understand the risks and understand how to avoid the pitfalls appropriately.
Thank you so much for that, gentlemen, and I completely agree with you. For the audience who are coming from financial institutions, this is really what Unit21 is all about. When we say that we are very data agnostic, this is what we mean. We can work with many different data sources that you already have in place, ingest them into one single place where you can conduct your investigation and operational efforts, and really to touch on all the points that both Chris and Jack just shared with us. So I believe you should see a queue or let's see, you should see a poll right now. And if you enjoyed this session and would like to hear more from our partners at Elliptic and Fingerprint, please select the checkbox and we will make sure to direct them to you. And we will start with our Q&A in a moment. For those of you who haven't submitted the question yet, you can use the Q&A button on your screen and submit the questions. We will try to address as many as we can. All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. I see some questions flowing in. Let's see, question. We have a question from a guest named Anton F. What are typical characteristics of a vulnerable person?
Yeah, so I'm happy to kick off on that one. Oftentimes there are a few different categories. It can be someone who is not particularly tech literate. That's a big one. Folks that don't have a lot of familiarity with technology. Maybe they may in some instances skew older. That's certainly something we've seen. They are oftentimes people that are sort of low information when it comes to technological adoption in general and crypto specifically. People who don't understand the irreversibility of a crypto transaction, that's a big problem, because a lot of times folks think, well, I sent these funds to a given person, right? But if it does turn out to be a scam, I can just call my institution and they can reverse the transaction. That just simply doesn't exist in crypto. A lot of times we'll also see people who feel socially isolated, maybe don't have extremely strong social skills, who are taken advantage of, and who may be sort of more easily exploited in this context. And that can be based on a lot of different factors, whether that be, the degree to which they're used to using the technology, their experience with similar events in the past, things like that. When you're looking at it from a behavioral risk detection perspective within an institution, I think a lot of it is going to be taking all of the known factors about your customer, right, and creating a profile as to whether you think they're likely for exploitation in general, and then layering on the romance scam specific risk factors on top of that when looking at one type of fraud typology, for instance.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Another question from a guest that we have live here. Anushain Sarfani asks, many clients, when confirmed about being a victim of a romance scam, are not comfortable or defensive. What are the measures to be taken to help them realize that they're actually being a victim? Jack, would you like to take that?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think for this one, it can be a mistake at times to probably try to attack someone's personal relationship, right? And try to explain how that relationship isn't what it seems. I think what usually solves a lot of opinions tends to be data. And I think if you can have the identification capabilities in place to show the historical log of how maybe this person has already committed certain types of similar fraud, that is really what can help the other person on the other end going through this emotional stress at the moment. Again, by explaining, hey, maybe we have an identification on this person. We've seen them commit acts of fraud like this in the past. You're not the only one. So again, you're not, as I think Chris was mentioning, you shouldn't feel any stigma. You shouldn't feel like you're of low intelligence to have fallen for maybe this scam in some way, but rather these are just kind of the facts, and you're not the only person out there that's experienced this type of fraud as well. So for me, I think when it comes to explaining these types of measures to somebody else in a way that is the most productive, it's usually using some amount of data to showcase previous examples of fraudulent behavior in the past, and to showcase, right, that this person, isn't necessarily dumb or of low intelligence or got swindled just because they fell to someone's tricks, right, on a particular platform. So again, I think data, identity, and some empathy probably go a long, long way in answering this question.
Thank you, Jack. There's a question here, Chris, I think you would like to take. What are the most common currencies or cryptocurrencies that scammers usually ask for victims to send?
Yeah, so generally speaking, it's Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is by far the most popular cryptocurrency in the market today, and it's where we see a lot of transaction activity in general. It also allows for certain privacy-enhancing functionality. So if you have something called a privacy wallet, which some folks may be familiar with, you can effectively mix crypto at the wallet level before sending it out again, which makes it more challenging for analytics firms like Elliptic to conduct analysis, although I should note, not impossible. Again, it is possible to see through privacy wallets and to determine who the ultimate sort of beneficiary and counterparty to that beneficiary might be. But that's certainly still the most popular one. Also, privacy coins are getting more and more popular in the illicit activity space in general. So people may have heard of Monero, whereas something like Bitcoin by default operates on a public blockchain, although again, they might use those mixing and privacy wallet technologies to obfuscate transactions. Monero is private by default. There is no public blockchain that an analytics firm can look to in order to conduct transaction monitoring. And because of that, it is oftentimes the preferred cryptocurrency of bad actors. And we've seen it in romance scams. We've seen it with dark web vendors. We've seen it with all types of bad actors. Sometimes you'll, in fact, in a dark web context, for instance, be offered a discount for paying in Monero. That's how much more challenging it is for transaction monitoring firms to follow, that it's actually worth bad guys offering a discount for payment of services in Monero. When it comes to romance scams, The majority, as I said, is still in Bitcoin, but we're certainly seeing growth in privacy coins that allow for folks to be exploited with much less of an ability to track their exploiter going forward.
Thank you, Chris. And we have another question, and I think this is for you, Jack. So the audience asks, why does the device identification really matters? Why does accuracy matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. What ends up happening is that there's this effect called drift, right? And what can happen is that device identification can drift over time. And so over a month period, a 6-month period, a year period, actually devices and identification of those devices can look somewhat different. So as an example, if your browser has a bunch of settings on it and those settings change over time, the fluctuations or the delta, right, in those settings we might call drift. And that might, really reduce the likelihood that you can identify reliably someone that comes back, say, a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now. Fingerprint has a bunch of ways to mitigate drift. I know we call ourselves a fingerprinting product and fingerprint is in our name, but actually fingerprinting is just one of the many techniques that we use. We actually use a multi-layered variety of techniques in order to create great browser and identification product, including device as well, so iOS and Android. And I think there was a related question here on how does it help with the victims. I think I just saw come through, and I'll try to speak to that real briefly. Actually, it wouldn't be the victims that you're trying to identify. It would be the scammers, right? So the folks that are actually committing the fraud, the bad actors is what you're trying to identify. And you're trying to make sure that this high level of accuracy identifies them when they come back, maybe if they come back from a different location, maybe if they come back on a device, but maybe in a different way. And perhaps, they maybe come back a month later, 6 months later, you're still able to, with a very high degree of accuracy, identify that bad actor. And then I think as Chris was mentioning earlier, you can add them to then a blacklist, right? So you can say, all right, this is a potential or a known bad actor. We know that we don't want them to leverage the service. We know we don't want to leverage or let them on our platform. We can block them now in some way. Even if you say there are some signs of a risk there and you don't necessarily want to go all the way to blocking someone, it's still so helpful in order to correlate other annotations of data and bits of data and events of data to create an event timeline. And even in such a way that you can then challenge those users, right? To say, are you actually who you say you are? Let's do a challenge check and make sure. So that's why fingerprinting is so important, or at least identity is so important. Fingerprinting is just one of the many techniques that fingerprinting, the company, uses in our product. And lastly, that's really the mechanism that we see most of our customers leveraging in order to add these bad actors to a blacklist or to challenge them to ensure that they're not committing acts of fraud and really ruining a bunch of other products for the rest of the users on those platforms.
Thank you, Jack. Question for you, Chris. Can you share any numbers or insights around how Elliptic helping their customers to reduce fraud losses?
Yeah, happy to. So I think it's hard to share specific numbers because there's such a broad range of sort of fraud typologies that we see. But when it comes to how it works in practice, we've been able to help some of the largest exchanges in the world, along with major federal regulatory and law enforcement agencies, to track scammers acting on chain. And, one of the big misnomers in crypto is that things are a black box. These are all anonymous parties. Crypto is not anonymous. That's something we emphasize over and over again. It's pseudo-anonymous in that you can't necessarily tie a definite identity to a crypto address, although certainly we do work with partners who help to make those associations. But what you can do is track all movements that occur on chain, as I mentioned earlier. And what that means is when you find a bad actor, someone who is engaging in a romance scam, let's say, you can follow them to the ends of the earth to make sure that they are not able to benefit from that bad activity. And that's a significant upside that crypto has over fiat. We'll often say there's no better way to launder money or to hide the proceeds of a scam than to have a duffel bag full of $10 bills, right? In crypto, you don't have that ability. The funds will always be followed by transaction monitoring firms like Elliptic, and we consistently work with law enforcement agencies to seize those funds and to return them to their rightful holders when possible. Sometimes it's very challenging. Sometimes investigations take years, but ultimately, when that person does try to exit out to a fiat currency, Elliptic is there to help law enforcement to stop that from happening.
Thank you for that, Chris. And there is another question, I believe it's for you in regards to what you said earlier about doing your own KYC when you've been asked to send cryptocurrency somewhere. So we have a guest named Luis Hernandez asking what are some of the things to look for in a cryptocurrency wallet in regards to Roman scams. So before I actually decide to send cryptocurrency to someone else and I decide to look at their wallet, what should I look for?
Yeah, so primarily, this is something that is likely to be done by an exchange, by some sort of centralized intermediary that someone might be using to transmit or hold crypto. So they can, for instance, leverage Elliptic's tools to look at that counterparty wallet and look at the total concentration of risk associated with romance scams, for instance, within that wallet. Realistically, we would recommend looking at the totality of risk across a large number of different potential types of bad activity that might be associated with that wallet and making a determination as to whether you're comfortable with that entity or that person as a counterparty or not. For just a person, a regular person, not an institution, who has their unhosted wallet and is being asked to send funds to another person's unhosted wallet, the main due diligence that they'll have to conduct is offline. It's ensuring that this is not just a relationship that you established over social media where you don't really know the person and maybe you're being wooed, maybe you're being manipulated, and you can't be sure whether or not you're being scammed. You should have in-person relationships with people, and you should actually know the individual in question before you send them any funds, unless you are willing to lose those funds, right? I mean, if it's worth $100 or whatever the equivalent might be in order for you to see this through, that's up to the individual, but they should understand that anytime you send funds to an unknown counterparty that you have no track record of dealings with, that there's no sort of public information on, you are at high risk of losing that money. And we've spoken about this quite a few times now, but people are very hesitant to report that type of exploitation because they feel as though they've been duped. They feel like that personal relationship has been used against them. And so we really want to make sure you can avoid that pain by not sending the funds in the first place.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I think this is all we got time for today. So thank you so much for joining us. And if we didn't get to answer your question today, we will make sure to follow up with you directly. And if you'd like to speak with us further, please visit our website at unit21.ai and contact us. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, Jack, for sharing your insights and wisdom and knowledge with us today. And thank you all for joining for today's session. See you in the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.